We're going to be exploring the laws and the realms and the deeper meaning behind the mitzvah of Tevilas Keilim. And the Gemara tells us in Avodah Zarah, explaining from the verse in the Torah, in Devarim 31:23. It tells us, Tana v'kulan tzrichim tvila ba'arbaim seah. Tells us that a vessel that is made from metal requires tvila, which means it needs to be placed into the mikveh. And it's a normal mikveh, which is the quantum of 40 seah. And the Gemara asks, Minahani mili, where do we know this from? How do we know that's a requirement? So Amarava, Rava tells us, Damar Kra, it's taught in the pasuk, in the verse, Kol davar sheyavoy be'esh, taviru be'esh, betaher. Listen to this carefully. Anything that comes through fire must pass through fire, vetaher, and you must purify it. Hoisif lecha kasuv, tahara acheres. So what we see here is off the bat, we see a requirement that a person who buys a vessel, or this particular verse was speaking about vessels that were garnered through capture after waging war, after waging battle. And these were from the spoils of that battle. And these were non-Jewish vessels. So the vessel would require to be kashered through fire. If it was used with fire, it needs to be kashered through fire. The way that something comes into a vessel is the way that it expunges that entity from the vessel. And then it uses a word that says v'taher. V'taher means purify it. And what we learn from this is there's an added requirement to purify. What is this requirement? The Gemara concludes it's a requirement to dip or to immerse a vessel into a mikveh. Okay? That's at this point in time what we've learned. Now the Gemara continues and tells us what type of vessels are we dealing with. And Rabbi Yochanan tells us, Keilim mateichos amurim beparsha. It's only talking about metal vessels. So if you buy a pot or a pan, those vessels would require to be toiveled into a mikveh. And same too with cutlery. A person has a knife or a fork made from metal, those vessels require tvila in a mikveh. Now, does it stop there? Okay, what we're doing at this point in time is just briefly outlining the mitzvah before we go into a deeper understanding of what is found within the requirements or the deeper sensitivities or the spiritual relevance of this mitzvah. So we know that it doesn't only stop by metal. Amar Rav Ashe tells us, Hane klei zuchuchis, hoil, v'chi nishtabru yesh lehem takana, kekli meteicho istamul. That's very, very important information. How do we treat glass? So the Gemara tells us glass, because it has the properties of being broken and then being able to be fixed where you could melt it down, it's like metal. So just like metal, you could heat it up and join it or refashion a vessel. Same too with glass. One would be able to rectify or refashion the glass through melting it down. So it thus takes on the properties of metal. Okay. So what we see from this is it's an extrapolation. The extrapolation is from the rabbis. The rabbis take this principle of metal and they infer it to glass. And thus, the only two real vessels or materials that would require to be immersed in a mikveh are vessels that are used for food, the consumption of food, or the cooking of food, or the storing of food. And they need to be made from the two materials of metal and glass. Okay? Now, the question is, and it's an important question, and that is why. Okay, we see that this is a principle that applies only particularly to Jewish vessels. So if you if you go to a friend that's not Jewish and they offer you a drink of water in their glass, do you have an issue with drinking from that glass? And the answer is no. It only pertains to Jewish vessels or Jewishly owned vessels. And that's really a question. Why is that something that is so particular to Jewish vessels? What the Yerushalmi tells us is that, the Talmud Yerushalmi tells us this, that it's very similar to a conversion, where just like an individual converting from not being Jewish to being Jewish needs to go through a mikveh, same to the vessels that they use also needs to go through a process of conversion, so to speak, where the vessel is now able to be utilized by a Jew. Now, it sounds good and well to say this as a general principle, but let's try and understand the deeper meaning behind why this has to happen. So we're going to be looking at source number 4, which is from the Likutei Halachos, which is the teachings of Rabbi Nassan, the student or the Talmud Muvhak of Rabbi Nachman of Breslov. It tells us like this on a deeper level, and these again are going to be very, very deep introspective spaces that a person is able to glean deeper spiritual relevance behind the activities and the mitzvahs that the Torah gives us. It says like this, Keilim Shalachila. It's specifically by vessels that are used for eating. Why? Ki ali de'achila mamshichin achayas. Why? He says, because when a person eats, what are they doing? Is they're drawing life force into themselves. They're absorbing energy and they're absorbing spiritual energy, as we've spoken about before, nitzoitzos, which are spiritual sparks that are found within the food, and it gives them life, it gives them vitality. And what he explains here is ma'aruach de le'ela la'ruach de le'tata. You're drawing a spiritual energy from above down into your life, into your body. That a person takes something from the potential and draws it into the actual of themselves. Okay, these are important transitionary spaces that a person is going through in terms of energy. Now he explains, well, okay, if that's the case, asur le'echol mikli akum shutmeim la'achilas Yisrael. It is prohibited thus to eat from a non-Jewish vessel, which means a vessel that has not yet gone through this transition, that belongs to you, but has not yet gone through this transition. A person is not allowed to utilize that vessel or eat from that vessel. Okay, which is a fascinating question in itself. If we're saying that there's a problematic energy associated with a metal or a glass vessel, by virtue of it not going through this transformation, why is it then okay for a Jew to eat from that vessel if it belongs to a non-Jew? But it's not okay for a Jew to eat from that vessel if it belongs to a Jew. That's question number 1. And question number 2 is an interesting halacha, which we can try and understand. This does not make food no longer kosher. So if a person cooked food in a vessel that was not toiveled in a mikveh, the food is not kosher. It's just prohibited to consume the food on such a vessel. Okay, so we're going to explore why these elements apply. He says further, Ki achayos shemekablim melamala ikar agia lamshich achayos b'kedusha u'b'inyan tikun hakeilim. Listen to how beautiful that is. If a person wants to draw spiritual energy into their life, they want to experience a vitality, they want to draw chiyus. We know this word even in South Africa, chiyus. Yeah, you want to draw life and energy into your life. How do you do so? One of the most fundamental steps in doing so is rectifying something called the vessel. A person has to first rectify a vessel, meaning in themselves, they have to consider, how am I as a vessel for life? Yeah, we often complain, I don't have enough energy, or I'm not experiencing enough vitality in my life. Well, am I a vessel for life? Am I a vessel to engage with life, to hold life, to cook life, so to speak? Ki im kafi tikkun kelim. Listen to how he says this, a very, very powerful statement. It's impossible to draw in energy below if not yet having rectified a person's vessel, their container. And listen to how far he takes this. Essentially, this is the entire role of the Torah and the mitzvot of the Torah. It's all there to rectify and fix up a person's vessel. So they may have a bucket, they may have some type of an entity, a container, but that container can have cracks, it can have holes, it can have not enough of a structure to hold anything, might be too small. The Torah and the mitzvahs are there to develop that structure, to develop that bucket, to create a space of being a vessel for holiness and a vessel for life. And that's why it says, once you have a vessel, once you've worked on yourself spiritually, and we're going to see what those steps are, then you can become an entity or an energy force to hold spirituality. You can become an entity to hold these things. Again, if you consider even just the simple act of consuming food, it is an act where a person is drawing energy into themselves and has a very, very powerful spiritual experience, often a very physical experience. But behind the scenes of their physical experience is a very spiritual one in which we are absorbing energy into our lives and essentially representing the general force of living where we're absorbing energy into our lives. Thus, when we engage with this act of drawing energy into our lives, we have to be very sensitive to the vessel. Is the vessel pure? Is the vessel rectified? Thus, a vessel that comes from an individual who is an idolater or an individual who has not yet absorbed a state of consciousness, which we're going to see in a moment, it is prohibited to eat food on that vessel. Because the vessels of a non-Jew are considered vessels that are broken. That cannot absorb the water, contain the water. They're unable to draw the spiritual energy into a space where it can hold that consciousness of God and that consciousness of what the Torah represents. Okay, so this is a broader overview of the importance of this mitzvah and why we are so sensitive to this mitzvah in association with the vessel. What is so unique about the vessel that we have to now take this? Isn't Judaism, when it comes to kashrus, all about the food? What we're seeing here, it's not. There's a very deep sensitivity to the vessel. And what this mitzvah is there to draw us into is the sensitivity around the vessel. It's interesting today, actually, I had the opportunity of going to Tevilas, some dishes and some things that have been sitting there. Maybe they've been sitting in my boot for a while, and I thought, you know what a great opportunity to finally go and Tevilas them in the mikveh, especially that we're talking about this tonight. And it was such a sensitivity, taking them and thinking, in my own life, where am I creating a state of being a vessel for life? And how am I as a vessel to absorb the energy of life, to absorb the energy of the relationships around me in a positive way? How much space do I create for those spaces with purity? And essentially what we're learning from Rabbi Nachman is that this mitzvah is there to sensitize ourselves to our own vessels, in ourselves, in our actions, in our lives. Now, he gives us a very powerful sensitivity that is able to really draw in an understanding of what can break one's vessel. How do you break your vessel? God forbid. So he says in the next verse, in the next source number 5. Mitzvah Tevilas Keilim, Amar Eliezer HaKohen. What's fascinating is that this mitzvah of toiveling one's dishes, putting them into the mikveh. Who was the one that actually spoke this over to the Jewish people? And what's fascinating is it comes from Eliezer HaKohen. Comes from Eliezer, who was together with Moshe Rabbeinu in the desert, but due to Moshe Rabbeinu's sin that transpired, and we'll see what sin that was, he was unable to teach over this particular law. And listen to what the sin was. It says, "Ve'eis sheba Moshe lechlal kas al inyan benois Midyan shenichshalu behem Yisrael b'dava bilam." What transpired was the Jewish people sinned with the daughters of Midian, and when Moses found out, he got extremely angry. His anger prevented him from teaching over this particular law. Listen to this powerful concept. He says, if you want to have a vessel, or you want to be a vessel for life, to draw in energy, one of the first things a person needs to focus on is fixing up is fixing up one's anger and one's troubled state. When a person's in a state of anger, or they're very reactive, or they're unable to hold themselves, and they're unable to let go of that energy, and it just consumes them, what that does on a spiritual level is it breaks their vessels. It prevents them from opening up that energy force to life. They become subsumed and myopic in terms of that particular energy of being so enmeshed in one's emotions and anger that a person is unable to be a vessel for life. So what Rabbi Nachman is saying is one of the first steps that a person needs to do or engage with in order to fix up their vessel is to work on their anger. And that's why Moses was unable to teach this law, and Eliezer HaKohen had to teach this law because he got angry. Now, what does the mikveh have to do with this? Why particularly placing this vessel in the mikveh? Why does that help? And number two, why particularly metal? What's this association with metal? So the Likutei Halachos carries on, and he tells us in another area, and this is an area that deals with netilas yadayim, with washing one's hands in the morning, but he's going to deal with this concept which he brings in here. It says, "Kli sheyatzem reshus oivdei kochavim, tzrichim letoivlem b'mikvah, shehaya ra'ui lechol bo Yisrael." If a Jew buys a vessel from a non-Jew, it has to be immersed in a mikvah in order for it to be fitting for consumption. Why? So he's going to explain what the mikveh does. And this is also going to teach us how we then able to rectify our anger. What are we able to do when we have those, fractures in our vessels because there's so much pressure on the vessel? There's that anger and there's almost that explosive energy in the vessel that it's going to break it. So what are you meant to do? He says, that vessel has to go into a mikveh. Shehu bechinas hashkacha, bechinas das, bechinas kimale haaretz der kamayim. Why? Because what a mikveh is the energy, this primordial energy, where all that existed prior to existence, it says, was water. It says that Hashem's energy was merachefes al pnei hamayim. It was just hovering upon the water. So the mikveh, when a person engages with a mikveh, what they're engaging with is the energy of hashgacha. It's an understanding that all there is in life is Hashem running the show, running the world. And that awareness that all there is Hashem is found in the verse in Yeshayahu that says Hashem fills the world. And that's a consciousness that is analogous to water. So dipping that vessel, again, which we are saying is representing ourselves as a vessel for life, to accept and to contain the energy of life and bring consciousness to the world that we live in, is something that is compromised potentially by certain energy forces, one of them being anger. And the way to heal that energy is by dipping it into a mikveh. Why? We said that the mikveh represents this consciousness that all there is Hashem, and everything in my life is essentially being run by Hashem, and that's nothing to be angry about or to worry about. He continues and tells us that when a person consumes food, it has to be with great sanctity. Ve'ika kedusha sa'achila hu alidei hadas shu hisgalus hashkacha. Now, how do you retain a sense of holiness when you eat? What are you meant to do? So many people say, no, the way to eat with holiness is maybe you need to eat challah. Challah is a holy thing, or maybe you need to drink kiddush wine. Maybe that's a holy thing. But what we see here is the holiness of one's consumption is premised on their consciousness. And what the consciousness is when I'm eating, I'm aware that the food that's in front of me is a manifest energy from Hashem. That Hashem has caused this energy force to be in existence, and that I'm able to engage with it is a prism that I'm able to then view my entire life. That everything is a manifestation of Hashem, that Hashem has caused to be in my experience of life. Ki Adam Arishon pagam ba'achilas eitadas tovara, because we know the archetypal sin that started all of this off, our entire work that we have to engage with in life, was the sin of Adam and Eve. And what did Adam do? He sinned with the sin of consumption. He sinned through his eating, and that sin was associated with his lack of ability to see Hashem and Hashem's role and Hashem's commandments as something that he has to be able to humble himself towards. And that's where he says like this, that the space, the ikara pagam, achila, the main way to fix up eating. Again, we're not talking about your physical diet. Obviously, a person needs to be sensitive and conscious of the food that they eat, that it needs to be healthy for their body. But we're saying that when a person consumes the food, they consume it from a state of emunah. Emunah means they're aware that Hashem is manifesting this, that Hashem is surrounding them, that Hashem is giving them this food. The Ram levavcha v'shachachtes Hashem elokecha v'amarta belevavcha koichi v'yotzim yad yasali. Now, the opposite of which is where a person consumes from a space of it's owed to me, and I need to consume it because I own this. I've achieved this. This is for me to be able to devour. And the way that energy is something that seeps into their life is when they look at it and they only see it from a physical standpoint. And on a holistic level, when a person looks at their successes, or they look at their parnasa, or they look at their achievements, and they say, you know who achieved that? It was me. That's a scenario that prevents a person from seeing Hashem and creating a consciousness that all that exists in life is a manifest energy from Hashem. And he says, the shaber or levata bechinas hateva. And what a person needs to do is break the energy of physicality. And that is going to be able to take something from impurity to purity. The vessel of a non-Jew. Why is it so tameh? Why is it so problematic to consume from? Well, we said the consumption is drawing energy. Now, how am I engaging with this act of drawing energy? What type of energy do I want to draw into my life? Well, we see that there's two types of energy. There's an energy that a person gets from being obsessed with achievement and with accomplishment and saying, look at what I've done, look at what I've caused, look at what I'm able to achieve. And then there's an energy of realization that everything in this world is a gift. And everything in this world is a manifestation of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And when I simply am open to that consciousness, I automatically am drawing in energy into my life. And this is this transition that we're learning about through this mitzvah of Tevilas Keilim. Now, what we need to ask still, what we haven't answered, is why metal? Yeah, what's metal got to do with this? So he writes in another source in number 7 here. He writes, Ikar Kabbalah Satuma, the most susceptible vessel or material to this impurity is klei mateches, which is metal vessels. B'yoser mikol keilim, from all other vessels, all other materials, this is the worst. Why? He's going to explain in a moment. But he juxtaposes it with a earthenware vessel. Ava klei cheres, einem shum tikun shenivla ha'isa b'toicha. You know that you can't fix up a vessel that is made from earthenware. If it's being used for something that's not kosher, you can't fix it up. The only way to fix it up is to break it. There are ways of engaging with that vessel halachically if you leave it for 12 months, or if you put it in a kiln and you burn it up in an insanely high temperature. But generally speaking, it's impossible to fix up a vessel of that nature. While if we know a person treifs up, God forbid, they make something impure or make it not kosher, which happens, a person can rectify that by using fire, by boiling it, depending on how it was absorbed into the vessel. Okay. Ikar tefillah b'kli matechos, shesham mechinas apanim kanal, b'kli cheres she'ein sham panim tekdusha b'hem hefech hamamon. Listen to how he explains this. He says that this associative energy of impurity that a person needs to purify is something that is only able to find its space within metal. And the reason for that is that metal has a higher sanctity. And that sanctity is something that gets seeped with impurity, if not rectified. And he says its sanctity is associated with its continuity, with its potential to make money, with etc., etc. But the energy associated, nimtza, she'afra ba'alma hu hefech hamamon, she'esh be'achayis. But when it comes to an earthenware vessel, that earthenware vessel has no innate life to it. It's something that will be broken. It's like the earth, and it has no ability to sustain itself on a constant level. And because of that, it doesn't need to be toiveled. It does not get absorbed with that impurity. What we see again is the metal entity is very much associated with money. And a person's control over this world and a person's ability to have accomplishment in this world is very much on a physical level associated with money. And that's why a metal vessel needs even more sensitivity in order to be able to be fixed up. Now he says furthermore, we're going to then take ourselves to the next level. He goes on to speaking how the holy souls or the high souls are analogous to metal, in which you see that they get brought into this world. And he says, they can always be fixed up like metal. Okay, let's have a look at the following understanding. So what we've done so far is we've differentiated between earthenware vessels and metal vessels. We've understood that a metal vessel has this space of being constant and able to stay there. And thus, it almost gives a person a perception of stability. And he said it's associated with money, where a person looks to money to be a vessel for them in life. And that's where we need to engage with a greater sense of purification. Now, what's fascinating here is that we're told, and we saw this in the Gemara, that we extrapolate glass from metal by virtue of the heat associated with the metal. That metal is able to be heated down, and thus we extrapolate glass from that because it's able to be heated down. Now, what we can infer from this is something fascinating. The inference from this is that heat in our own lives is associated with the element of fire. And fire, we know, is associated with the attribute of anger. And where we started off with is this energy force of anger in our own lives is something that precludes us from that having that vesseled state. And that's why glass is something that we are attaching to metal in that it's able to be, or it has this ability to be engaged with fire. It's able to be merged together through fire, and thus it has a relationship to anger. And that's why we have a greater sensitivity to both metal and to fire. Now, to conclude here, what he writes here, and we're going to summarize these two sources, is all of these laws are learned out by the rabbis. And he explains that the process of following these laws is very much about focusing on something called emunas chachamim. Emunas chachamim is having faith in the rabbis and in the laws that are brought down by the sages, that are brought down in the Gemara and brought down in Halacha. And a person that is able to be sensitive to these laws and really draw these laws into their lives is rectifying a very powerful energy of being able to be a vessel. How are they rectifying that energy? They're rectifying it through their humility. They're able to say, you know what, I don't understand the full picture. I don't understand all of these elements fully, but I can appreciate that the Torah gives me the requirement to listen to the rabbis. And the way that these laws are brought down is through the rabbis, and these details are brought down through the rabbis. And this is where he juxtaposes. And he says that the difference between the Jews and the non-Jews is in that the non-Jews have the Bible. The non-Jews read the laws in the Bible and they hold by the Bible. But what transpires, what the difference is that they don't have emunas Yisrael. They don't have the same emunah that the Jewish people have to the rabbis and the way that those laws are brought down, which referred to as emunas chachamim. So this is a very, very powerful inference or insight in terms of dealing with this law. So to summarize, before we give maybe, I think we have 4 minutes left, to summarize, what essentially we're doing here with this mitzvah is we're understanding, or we're being sensitive to how to draw in energy in our lives. How do we draw energy into our lives? It's through being a vessel. What vessel are we putting out to absorb? If you want water, you want to absorb water, you want to contain water, you need to put a vessel out into the rain in order for that rain to fall and have water in that vessel. Same too in life. What type of vessel are we putting out? And what we see is that the energy forces that destroy our vessels is our anger and how we are able to be absorbed by a sense of arrogance. Those energy forces destroy our vessels. So we might even put those vessels out into the rain, but they can't hold the water. And this mitzvah comes along to say, put it into a mikveh. What a mikveh represents is the waters of das, the waters of consciousness of Hashem. And when I have the understanding that Hashem's hashkacha, Hashem's dominion, Hashem's presence, and Hashem's manifestation is everything and everywhere, I'm able to fix up that vessel. And I am able to do that through the Torah, through the mitzvahs, through emunas chachamim, through my trust in the laws of the rabbis that are brought down, that are deduced from the Chumash, deduced from the Torah. And that is something particular, we said, to metal and to glass by virtue of their special energy force, but we added by virtue also of their relationship to heat and to fire. And that heat and fire, we understand, is very much associated to anger and to that arrogance that destroys the vessel. So it needs a particular rectification through the mikveh, and then a person is able to then use that vessel for their food. We have a few minutes left for questions. Anyone would like to ask a question, please feel free to do so. We'll just open it up. Yes. Okay, my friends. Well, if there are no questions, I wish you a lot of bracha. Thank you for joining us tonight. And please, God, Hashem should help us have the vesseled spaces in our own lives, that we should be vessels for life, and understand that behind every single mitzvah is deep, deep secrets and deep meaning. And those are the spaces that we can explore and we need to be sensitive of anytime we look at the mitzvahs. But furthermore, extrapolating from these mitzvahs to teach us how do we live our own lives and what are the mitzvahs there to really create in terms of our consciousness. So please, God, Hashem should give us the blessing of Tevilas Keilim, should be able to take the vessels of our own lives and purify them away from the energy of anger and purify them away from the energy of arrogance, to be able to be open to experiencing life, to experiencing our relationships with more consciousness, with more openness, to be able to be present. And please God, through this mitzvah, that's something that we should receive as a blessing. Shkoyach. Thank you, everyone.